One of the more common things that confuses people that are new to Sublime is how to configure it. Unlike other applications, it doesn't have a preferences dialog, and instead we configure it by using text files instead. And this can be a little bit daunting when you're not used to it. So in today's video, let's demystify configuring Sublime Text. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. ODAT Nerd here. Welcome to this video on configuring Sublime Text. Before we get into that topic, though, as a reminder, if you are finding these videos in any way useful or helpful, I would love to know about it. So please do use those buttons down below the video to thumb, subscribe, and share as you deem appropriate. If you have any questions or comments on the content of this video or any of the videos on the channel, or if you have a suggestion for another Sublime Text topic you'd like me to cover in a future video, drop those down in the comment section below the video or hit me on Twitter at ODATNerd. But the topic we're here to talk about today is configuring Sublime Text. And before we get into that, let's also point out that this is a topic that's covered by the official documentation in Sublime Text. And down in the description of the video, I've linked to that documentation as a reference for you to brush up on anything that I don't explicitly talk about in this video. The place where you do most of your configuration of Sublime Text can be found by going into the Preferences menu and choosing the Settings item. And if you're on macOS, these items will be under the top-level menu under Sublime Text, as is common for that operating system. And I'm going to open that. And as I mentioned previously, unlike other applications that provide a dialog box with settings, perhaps with a tabs along the top and a tree along the side to allow you to navigate settings, Sublime opens this window instead. And I'm going to go ahead and maximize that window. And most of the configuration you do in Sublime can be found in here. Now, in the left-hand pane is a list of all of the settings that Sublime knows about in core Sublime before packages and other third-party plugins are added to it. And these settings provide all of the documentation that have the default values for the settings and what those settings do. And those are the settings that are in effect when you first install Sublime and run it for the very first time. The right-hand side of this particular window is my user-specific settings. Now, the very first time you start Sublime, this is just going to be an empty file with an open and close brace in it and nothing else. And the way you configure Sublime is by taking settings whose values you want to modify from the default and copying them from the left-hand pane into the right-hand pane and modify the value in there. And in use, Sublime applies all of the default settings first and then applies your changes on top of those settings. So you only need to have settings whose values you want to modify in there. And here I'm using the package dev package that we talked about in a previous package parade video. So by clicking the pencil icon next to any of these settings, I can go ahead and copy that over to my user settings. And we should also point out that these settings are actually JSON objects. The file type is Sublime settings, but it is a JSON or JavaScript object notation file. And what that basically means for our purposes, if you're unfamiliar with it, is it's a list of keys value. So the part to the left of the colon is the name of the setting. The value to the right of the colon is the value for that setting. And when you copy them into the preferences, as we can see here, you want those settings to be in a comma separated list. Now, although this is JSON, if you're familiar with JSON, you'll know that JSON is very strict about where commas can be placed and it doesn't allow comments. The JSON parser in Sublime is a little more lenient than the standard, and that's why we can have comments in here. Now, these default settings that we see in the left-hand pane are split into three different groups. The top group are the editor settings, and that controls things like the font options and the color schemes and how autocomplete works and things of that nature, things that are pursuant to actually working with the editor components of Sublime Text. The second set of settings in here are the user interface settings, and that controls things that cover the application as a whole. For example, the theme that the application is using, which here is the adaptive theme. That controls things like what the tabs look like and things of that nature, and whether or not various aspects are animated or not. And the third part is the application behavior settings that control how Sublime works as a whole. And examples of that are the list of packages that can be ignored or not, or the ability to save the state of the application when you quit into the session file and restore it back, upon restart versus wanting Sublime to close every file and save them when you quit and then open with a fresh window the next time you started. For the purposes of these two files here, the distinction between those different types of settings isn't important, but that's going to be important just a second. So that's why I want to cover that here. And I'd also like to point out that although these are the default settings on the left and my user settings on the right, there's actually one other file that's consulted here, and the file is dependent on what operating system you're on. Because if we see here, the font face and the font size, well, there's a font size defined, but there's not a font face. And the reason for that is that different operating systems have their own look and feel for how they should operate and how applications on them should operate to behave like a good citizen on that operating system. And some of those things are the fonts that are used. So there's no way for Sublime to fit in, if you will, on all of the platforms that it supports and just have one set of settings. So in between the preferences defaults and the preferences user, there's one other file that is consulted. And you can get to that by using view package file from the command palette. And because I'm on Windows, I can say the default Windows prefs like so. And we can see there's a default preferences Windows.sublime settings. And if I look in here, we can see what the font face and font size default to if you happen to be on Windows, as I am here. There's also one of these files for Linux, and there's also one for Mac OS. So I could do the same thing and use view package file and say default OS X settings, or prefs if you rather, and see this file here. And now there's more settings in here. The font face is Menlo. That's different than the font that was used for Windows. And there's also some settings in here that control how the application behaves. Now, there's not a way to edit these settings directly. And in fact, the settings in this default setting, if you look at the comments, they specifically call out when these settings in the defaults are overridden by one of those platform specific settings. So the takeaway from that is if you want those settings to be set to a specific value, you want to add them to your user preferences, for example, the font face and font size. If you're curious about what the application defaults are for your operating system, that's when you have to worry about looking in that file. But that's generally not something that you need to do. And 99% of every configuration option you're ever going to want to set in Core Sublime takes place in this very window. Now, in previous versions of Sublime, it didn't open settings in two windows like this. It would open the preferences menu here. Instead of having an option for settings, would have settings default and settings user. And each one of those menu options would open either the default settings, which here is on the left, or the user settings, which is here on the right. And you would have to manually choose one or both of those to look at settings. Newer versions of Sublime do it this way, and I'm only mentioning that here because the same system is also used for package settings as well. So we might note that for the override audit package, it has a single settings item and it opens its settings this way. But package control has settings default and settings user because it's trying to remain compatible with older versions of Sublime before this functionality was added. So depending on what you see on the internet when you're reading about this, you might be confused that it's telling you that there are menu options that you don't see in your copy of Sublime. That's nothing to be concerned about. These menu items are doing that all for you. If you happen to use projects in Sublime, there's another layer of settings that you can apply on a project-specific level. And if you're unfamiliar with projects, we're not really going to cover that in great detail here. That's a topic all its own worthy of another video. But in order to demonstrate this, on the right, I have just a regular Sublime window that is the one that we saw just a moment ago. I've moved it to the right-hand side of the screen. And here on the left-hand side of the screen, I'm going to use Quick Switch Project to open this C program here that I have been working on. And I'm going to go ahead and open the main.c file. And we're going to go ahead and hide the sidebar just to make these things easier to see. And we can see there is a C program over here as well. Now up here in the project menu, there's an item labeled Edit Project that will open the Sublime project file associated with the current window. You can also open this file manually if you want to. This is just a shortcut to do that because some people keep their project files outside of the folders they have open. And that's going to open the project file. And here I have a folders key. That's the key that most projects are going to have. They have that list the project folders that appear in the sidebar. I also have, as we can see on line 20, some build systems that are specific to just this particular project. And on line 17, there is this settings key. Now, this won't be here by default. You have to add this in manually. But inside of this key, when you add it, you can add any of the editor settings that we looked at in the previous part of the video. The settings at the top of the default settings. Those are the ones that control the editor as a whole. That means the user interface settings and the application behavior settings, those ones don't apply in here. Those can't be set on a per project basis because they are application wide. So you can't, for example, have the tabs in one project look different by a different theme as opposed to another window. Sublime doesn't work that way. But within those editor settings, we can do what we like. And to demonstrate that, we could add, say, the color scheme setting like so. And let's say we change this to the Mariana color scheme like this. Now we'll see as soon as I save this file, both of the tabs in this left window have changed to Mariana as a color scheme. But over in the right-hand side of the window, the right-hand window, I should say, rather, the color scheme is still the default Monachi. So we can see that the syntax highlighting used for C in this project is different than what is used in the right-hand window because the color scheme is different. And you could use any of those editor settings here. And you can use this, for example, if you have a project that you're working with other people, they might have a different idea of what tab sizes should be or whether tabs should be put in as regular tab characters or expanded to spaces, or that may be interesting in a project by project basis. So you could use those sorts of settings in a project to set something up specifically. Or as you've seen here, if you're working with multiple projects, you can assign different color schemes or different variations on the same color scheme by, say creating another copy of Monachi with a slightly different background color to color code your project windows for you. So this is another key way that you can configure Sublime and apply some settings. Now, any settings you put in the project settings key here override the settings in your user preferences. So these settings will take preference over those, but as is the case for the default settings, any settings you don't put in here would just work as they normally would. It's also possible in Sublime to configure settings on a file type by file type basis. And this is also useful for the same sorts of reasons as in the project here. And to demonstrate that, we're going to come over to this C file. Now, in order to do this, you need to be editing a file of the type whose settings you want to configure. And then you can go up into that preferences menu and choose settings syntax specific as we see here. And again, on macOS, that will be under the Sublime Text menu entry. And when we choose this, this window is going to open up, and I'm going to go ahead and maximize that. And we're going to see this is going to look very similar to what we saw previously. On the left are all of the default settings, just as they were when you use preferences settings. And on the right, there's a new file that has been created called c.sublime settings. And the C has to do with the syntax of the file that is currently being edited. So any editor settings we add in here will apply to files of that particular type. And in order to demonstrate that, we're again going to use a color scheme like so, and I'm going to paste in not Mariana, but we're going to use Celeste in this case instead. And I'm going to save that. And we'll see as soon as I close this window that both of the C files have changed to this rather white color scheme, but the project-specific file over here that's not a C file is still using the same color scheme as the regular project would be using. And in fact, if we were to open, say, a make file, because it's not a C file, it's also using this color scheme. And if we were to give the focus to this window over here and just create a new file and add some text, it's still using over here our user default settings of the Monokai color scheme. So we can see here for specific file types, you can apply more settings yet again, and those will override the project settings if there are any, and they'll also override your user settings as well. Now, jumping back over to this file here, this is also of importance because certain file types have very specific settings requirements in some cases. And an example of that is this make file here. If I select these lines, we can see that those lines have physical tab characters. Those lines aren't indented with spaces. And that's on purpose because make files require physical tabs for the rules in them, or make will refuse to process the file. You get weird cryptic errors out of it. So even if you decided that you prefer spaces to tabs for indenting, if you're editing a make file, it's important that this still be set that way. And this can be done with syntax specific settings. And I'm mentioning this here to point out that much like there's that platform specific user preferences, packages, the makefile package is an example of this, that provide a syntax can also provide the default settings that should be used for that syntax. You don't generally get to see them, as we saw when you edit the default, these syntax-specific settings. It shows you the default settings on the left to give you something to refer to for what these settings are. But for these sorts of files, you'd have to do that manually. And again, we can use view package file, and we can say make file settings like so, and here's the makefile.sublime settings. And if we pick that, we can open that and we can see that in makefile specifically, we want to detect indentation and translate tabs to spaces should be turned off. So regardless of what your settings might otherwise be in a makefile, translating tabs to spaces, that's the setting that makes Sublime, as it's injecting a tab character, instead replace it with spaces, not enabled in a makefile for very specific reasons. So far, we've talked about 6 different places that settings can exist in Sublime Text. The default preferences that ship in the default package, the platform-specific settings also in that package, your user settings, which set your overall settings for Sublime Text, the project settings if you happen to be using a project, the syntax specific settings provided by packages themselves, and your overrides to syntax specific settings. That's 6 different places. There's actually a 7th place where settings can be, but they're not represented in files. They're actually represented as view or buffer specific settings. And you probably use these all the time without actually realizing that you're doing it. And in order to demonstrate that, we're again going to go to the preferences menu and choose settings like so. And over here in the rulers, this is a setting that controls where the indent guides are automatically appear to show you key items in the file. I have it set to 80 by default. But if we set this to say 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, like so, as soon as I save the file, we'll see both of these files now have these lines appearing in them. We can see here at every 5 characters. And I'm going to go ahead and close that. And we can see that that applies over here in the project as well. It also applies in the default settings. And even if we were to jump to this C file, which are kind of hard to see in this particular color scheme, but those lines are there as well. And let's just go ahead and jump back to that make file to be able to see these a little bit better. Now, these are my default settings. Of course, you could also have these in project settings. You could also have them in syntax specific settings if you need to be guided for a particular file type. Say it's a file type that requires different aspects to be at certain columns in a file. But you can also modify these on the fly if you want. And if we go to the view menu, there's these menu items down here labeled ruler, and there's a few of these in here. There's 70, 72. These are the ones that are predefined. These these menu items actually modify that ruler's setting. And if I was to say, for example, set it to none, then in this file, there is now no rulers. But as we can see on the right-hand side of the screen, there is still rulers in that file, and there's also still rulers in this file as well. This is a buffer-specific setting, and there's a few of these that you might apply. Examples of that include the indentation, the line endings, where the word wrap happens, and spell checking is another example of that. So there's a fair few of these settings that are buffer specific settings. So that provides you yet another location for settings. So in our example, although we have project specific settings and we have syntax specific settings on top of that, say in our C file, if we needed a setting to be different against all of those for one particular C file while we're working on it, we still have the facility to do that without messing up the settings anywhere else. So there we have it. Although it may seem like a daunting topic, configuring Sublime is actually not as complicated as you might think. And it's actually pretty expressive and powerful as well. So I hope you found this video helpful. And if you have, please use those buttons down below to subscribe, and share as you deem appropriate. And if you have any questions or comments on the content of this video or any of the videos on the channel, or suggestions for other Sublime Text topics you'd like me to cover in a future video, please also leave those down in the comments section below, or hit me on Twitter at ODATNerd. But until that next video, this is ODATNerd asking you to please have a sublime day.